Hello and welcome to today's discussion where we explore and dissect the findings of the 2023 India edition of Havas's proprietary Meaningful Brand Study. Since 2009, Havas's annual Meaningful Brands report has studied the relationship between brands and consumers, focusing on the importance of meaningfulness in brand perception and business performance. By examining brand value, new behaviors, shifting cultural dynamics and priorities, the study aims to understand and actualize how brands can create positive impact. One statistic that baffles us all is that people or consumers wouldn't care if 73% brands disappear today. So, what happens if your brands disappear tomorrow? How do you ensure that your brand becomes a permanent fixture in the lives of your consumers? So, how can your brand get into the league and become more meaningful? We take a deep dive into the findings with two experts from Havas India family, Sanchita Roy, Chief Strategy Officer, Havas Media India, and Anirban Mozumdar, Chief Strategy Officer, Havas Creative India. Welcome Anirban and Sanchita. Anirban, I'll start with you. Tell us, what is Meaningful Brand Study?
So firstly, thanks for having us here. So the Meaningful Brands is actually a very unique global framework. This whole study started in 2009, as you mentioned. And it links brands, in terms of their performance and their behaviors and their communication to human well-being. So that's the uniqueness of what Meaningful Brand is actually about. The study itself, this year, 2023 has been about 91,000 odd people in the field, 10 odd countries, and a lot of brands, sub-brands and categories. So it is actually also part of our investment as Havas in data-driven creativity, which is a key pillar that we've always believed in. So this is actually part of walking the talk. What the study also does is that consumers actually evaluate brands and categories in terms of the key functional, personal and collective benefits that they seek. And basis that evaluation, we are able to see what are the gaps when it comes to experiences and what consumers actually expect. Therefore, we are able to create extremely actionable, meaningful connections and brand and marketing actions basis of this study. So that's what Meaningful Brand Study is in a nutshell.
Sanchita, I'll come to you. Tell us how we use meaningful brands and why should marketers care about it?
So, as you mentioned in your opening remarks and as Anirban touched upon, the Meaningful Brand Study actually puts together, what is consumers' expectations from brands today. So if you look at the study, it's across three critical pillars of functional, collective, and personal benefits. It tracks 18 dimensions to understand where does brand stand, in a consumer's life in terms of, what is the value that they deliver, what is the expectation that consumers have of brands, and therefore, how can brands deliver on that. So I think it's onto its 15th year, it's a very critical piece of study because it actually tells three critical things for us. It tells us, what are consumers' expectations from brands across these three pillars. It tells us the gap between consumers' expectations and experience, and therefore, what are the opportunity areas that brands need to focus upon. And what it really does is, because over the last so many years, especially in a post-pandemic world, we've seen that consumers' expectations of brands has been on a rise. They expect brands to not only help them have a better life, but they expect brands to make them happy, lead a healthier life, make life easier, simple, affordable. So all this, so if you look at the Meaningful Brand Study, it actually tells you, and you mentioned the top 10 brands. So for each of these brands, it will tell you, how are they stacking up across these three critical pillars, and therefore, what are the need gaps today that a brand needs to fulfill in the consumer's life. And therefore, it becomes so much more important for marketers because, it tells you, to move beyond your basic, media metrics or basic media business metrics to actually lay the rule of, what are those opportunities that you need to, capitalize on, or what are those opportunities that you can leverage on.
True.
Okay. Anirban, coming back to you, tell us what are the big themes emerging out of the India MB study 2023?
So it's been very interesting, Pritha. I think the last time we did this study, we found we had this whole theme around the age of cynicism, where consumers were really getting, put off by brands doing what you might call a form of purpose washing, right? Talking a lot about purpose, but announcing and being more grandiose about it than really meaning a difference. I think this year it's become very interesting. It's where consumers are really focused on saying, dear brands, marketers, solve my life first. I think the big thing that we are seeing is somewhere between solving a very functional problem, let's say a skin need or something, and something that is a really big cause, right? Could be, preserving wildlife or being very careful about animal cruelty, which are important. I think there is this big gap of can you solve for my personal wants, my individual needs a lot more closely, right? And that is what we are terming this time as the rise of the Me-conomy, where the person, the human being, their wellness, their positive attitude is the center of what brands would want to talk about, what brands want to address in order to become more meaningful. So to me, that's sort of the big thing, that now purpose, which is an era that I think has started in marketing and there's definitely no going back, now gets personal. So consumers are looking for brands and companies to solve for positivism, giving them that sense of resilience, stand next to them. It's not easy. There is a lot of ecological and economic crisis. And it's really interesting because, consumers are getting impacted by these crises. So even something like climate change is no longer distant. In fact, in our study, I think nearly 1 out of 4 people say that they're personally impacted in myriad ways by each of these things that we always have thought of as macro issues. They are no longer. So n equal to 1 is going to be far more important for brands than 8 billion. And I think that's the sort of the big message this time. Looking for simplicity, looking for control, but above all, what are you going to do for me personally is the big question and the big theme that has come out this year.
So tell us, Sanchita, what are the key aspects of the study this year?
So there are 2 things the Meaningful Brand Study tracks. One is the Meaningful Brand Index, which basically takes into account the functionality score and the brand equity score. It has a 50% weightage to each of the parameters to actually arrive at what is a meaningful brand index. So how do we use that? We see, we do a trend analysis over the last couple of meaningful brand study to see, if there has been a movement in the scores, and if yes, then what is driving that movement? What is it that the brands have done? Across which pillars do we see the change? So for example, in certain categories, you'll see that, while Anirban spoke a lot about, the Me-conomy and, how personal benefits are stacking up, there are categories where, your functional still is very critical.
Absolutely.
And there are categories where we've seen that, the shift has happened from personal to functional. So what it really tells us is the brand equity score. It can actually tell you where does your brand stand, and therefore what is it that you need to do, or what is it that you need to focus on. The other thing that the study gives us is the meaningfulness score, which basically, how do you get it? You track the attachment and the quality of life. So so you see the average of attachment into quality of life. It gives you the meaningfulness score. So again, it says if you are, say, a brand that has been covered in the last 3 studies, you could actually understand, what is the meaningfulness score that it is delivering currently with whatever it is that the brand is doing. So how do we use the study? We see what are the findings, and then we actually slap on, what are current, the activities that are happening in the market. What is the brand doing in terms of media, in terms of their overall communication, and then arrive at, what probably is working better, what probably could be done better. So that's how, we study. And in this whole report, this year's report, it clearly states that brands that actually, are delivering on personal benefits are actually doing 40% better on their meaningfulness and stuff like that. So I think that way what it really gives the marketers is almost cues for what is it that they need to work upon, improve, start, stop, continue. So I think that is how we generally use it for the categories that we track.
And as we enter into the final round of conversation, I want both of you to touch upon the consumer insights as per the new MB report.
Yeah.
So Anirban.
So this year it's interesting. Yes, as she said, apart from the Meaningful Brand Index or MBI, which is specific to brands, and then we have the Meaningfulness Score, which she spoke about. There is a separate thing we've done this year on the consumer insights. So basically, what it does, consumer insights is a set of 6 or 7 questions, which is actually about how consumers are looking at and responding to this current sense of crisis, or the crisis, let's say, hopefully we are all emerging from, at least in India, it's a lot more positive. So we begin with things like what is their whole life situation and state of optimism, what is their perception, how deep do they think the crisis is, and that's where we are talking about things like, it affects me and it affects me in myriad ways. Then I think there's interesting part of how are they what are the values with which they are responding to this? Are they taking a certain sense of personal responsibility? We get into aspects of behaviors. What are the things that they have gone back to post-pandemic? What are the things that they have started doing afresh, right? And then we end with this little bit on attitudes and what is the factual state on hybrid work, right? I think the last part of it is very interesting, the last question, which is about who, the onus is on who to solve the crisis. So I think the India findings are interesting because I think there's a lot of people who are saying, look, I am doing a lot and I can even make some sacrifices if the government or any regulatory authority were to create a certain kind of mandate. So I think these are some of the insights, which is what is the consumer's perception of this particular crisis that we are going through, how are they responding to it at an individual level, at behavioral level. And I think the third part is where do brands, how can we help, how can we really genuinely make a difference? Because the consumers really believe there is an onus. We are part now of, brands are part of the citizenry. We can no longer say they're just, makers of goods and services.
Sanchita?
So I think, one of the key things that stood out in the study this year is from consumer perspective, that they expect brands to bring back that optimism and energy into their lives. The expectation from brands has really gone up manifold times. So it's not only about personally impacting them, but they also expect brands to bring about that social and environmental changes as well. So because the expectations have become so much more from brands, I think what we did, it actually lays down rules of what brand should be doing.
Yes.
Like and I think this question would be a lot. It's also about consumers and it's about brands as well, right? So it finally, if you look at the study, it actually clearly lays down what are those 8 principles that one needs to follow to make any brand meaningful. One of them is how do you make mental health and well-being universal, because that is what consumers' expectations are. They want brands to simplify their lives. They want brands to make life easier, make it affordable, and therefore all of it has an impact on the final mental and health of individuals.
Yeah.
That is one of the expectations. They expect brands to be more inclusive,
Yes.
to understand, so basically the expectation is that I should be able to, be my natural self. I should be able to say my point of view. So I think they want brands to be more inclusive. They want brands to have no fuss. They don't want drama in their lives. So if your communication is transparent, if your communication is clear, they want brands to come and say, what it is and how things are as is, and not do any kind of greenwashing or anything. They want it as good as it can get. The other thing that we also saw was making things affordable for them, making things accessible. So there are brands that brands has to, if they have to become more meaningful, they also have to become more accessible to consumers. So I think these are some of the things that really stood out. And but then, as I said earlier, each category would have its nuances.
Yes.
So I think depending on which category we are deep diving into, we'll get more nuances of how does the meaningful brand index or the meaningful score stacks up for them? What are the consumer insights? What are the brand insights? So I think, but this is overall, what's coming out through the study. But yeah, I think as next steps, it's more about deep diving into each of the categories.
Okay, and my final question to both of you, as they say that save the best for the last, is there a cheat sheet or a playbook for brands to become more meaningful?
No, absolutely. I think that's some of the themes that she already alluded to in her conversation is part of what we are calling a playbook. So I think while categories and individual brands will also need to see which of these they want to take as the strongest action points, there is a very clear 8-point playbook for brands to become more meaningful in the Me-conomy. I think the second important point for us at Havas is being a village where it's all kinds of people solving all kinds of problems. I think the one or two things which I definitely think are going to be very interesting for us also as a company and a brand going forward. I think this whole idea of mental and physical wellness becoming universal, I think is one massive theme across the board. And I think it doesn't matter what category or brand you are on, you need to start thinking about how you're going to contribute to this, because clearly it's being called out. I think the second part again, which is I think very interesting, is this whole idea of individual expression and identity. And one of the principles we are talking about is brands becoming platform, where a brand like Havas Play, for example, is really doing interesting work in how you can actually talk to consumers as communities and as collective consumers with personal benefits rather than at a overall kind of global or macro level. So I think it's a very interesting time ahead for us as well with all of these themes coming out.
So I'll end with you, Sanchita. Anirban has already revealed that there is a playbook for brands. Tell us functionally, how can brands use this playbook to become more meaningful?
So as I said earlier, I think we need to start deep diving into category to understand category specific nuances and see how does those 8 principles that we have laid out, how does it translate for that category? Because today, it is going beyond, your regular, whatever you're doing, you need to somewhere connect, with your consumers at a personal level, at an emotional level. And I think the meaningful brand study just helps us do that, because it actually gives us those cues for opportunities, right? And therefore, as we start deep diving into each of the categories, I think it will become very clear of what are the how should we because the playbook is going to change for each category, but the broad themes are all there for brands to capitalize on. And and I think I'll urge everyone to start using the meaningful brand study as part of their everyday work, because there is a lot of insights that comes out of it, and especially with Havas Play and all, it will actually give them cues for how to frame that entire communication, not only Havas Play, to the creative agency, to the media agency, because we are in the communication business, and what the meaningful brand study does is actually give us those cues.
Thank you, Sanchita. Thank you, Anirban, for joining us today. Thank you for watching us. Do write to us if you want the full report or you want to take a deep dive into your specific category, because there are 15 categories and 155 brands. See you again.